In this presentation, I'm going to discuss Cost and Choice, Insight for Choosers, and dive into James Buchanan's influential work. I'll be referencing the book itself, Cost and Choice, An Inquiry in Economic Theory by James Buchanan, and the Liberty Classic Book Review by Byron Carson. Published in 1969, this book challenges traditional economic thinking by redefining how we understand cost. Buchanan argues that cost is not an objective, measurable value, but a subjective experience tied to individual choice. By examining this key concept, Cost and Choice provides powerful tools for better connecting prices, values, and human behavior, offering profound implications for both private decision-making and public policy. Through this presentation, we'll explore Buchanan's critique of economic models, his insights on opportunity cost, and the real-world application of his ideas. Buchanan's work in Cost and Choice challenges traditional economic thinking by focusing on the concept of opportunity cost. He argued that costs are not just monetary, but reflect the trade-offs individuals face when making choices. Unlike earlier economic theories that viewed costs solely in terms of market prices, Buchanan emphasized the subjective nature of costs, depending on the individual preferences and the alternatives they forego. He contended that every decision involves an evaluation of what is sacrificed in order to pursue a certain action. This perspective encourages a deeper understanding of the decision-making process, where costs are tied to the individual personal preferences and the options they must relinquish. In The Limits of Liberty, Buchanan critiques how economists define and apply the concept of cost. Traditionally, economists treat cost in a narrow monetary sense, but Buchanan emphasizes a broader, more comprehensive understanding that reflects the true costs individuals face in decision-making. He develops logical tools to help us better understand human behavior and the role that costs, values, and incentives play in shaping our decisions. One key point Buchanan makes is the need to connect prices, costs, and values in a way that reflects real-world decisions, both in private and public sectors. This approach has significant implications for how we think about policies and economic systems, urging us to reconsider how costs are internalized and how decisions are made in both markets and governments. Ultimately, Buchanan's work calls for a more nuanced understanding of cost that takes into account individual choices, societal preferences, and the limitations imposed by collective decision-making processes. Adam Smith, in his classic economic theory, viewed opportunity cost as something objective and measurable, such as labor time. For Smith, the cost of a good or service was linked to relative prices and the resources required for production. In this framework, cost was seen as an external, quantifiable concept. Buchanan, however, critiques this assumption, pointing out that economists often treat costs as objective and fixed, disregarding the role of subjective choice in decision-making. He argues that individuals perceive and experience costs differently based on their unique preferences, circumstances, and opportunities. By overlooking this subjectivity, economists miss the full complexity of how individuals weigh costs and make decisions in real life. Buchanan emphasizes that cost is not an objective, measurable factor, but something that depends on personal value judgments and subjective choices. Suppose you are comparing two tasks, writing code at a rate of 20 lines per hour and reading at 40 pages per hour. From Smith's perspective, opportunity cost can be computed objectively, meaning you could calculate that the opportunity cost of writing one line of code is equivalent to 2 pages of reading. Smith would argue that this calculation is straightforward based on the measurable time it takes to complete each task. While Smith might calculate objective opportunity costs, real-world prices don't align with these calculations. As demand for lines of code increases, for instance, people may be willing to pay more for coding services regardless of the objective time that could have been spent reading. This suggests that the market price of a line of code can remain higher than its calculated opportunity cost if demand stays strong. This disconnect between theoretical opportunity cost and market prices could challenge the idea of economics as a predictive science. Alternatively, it could indicate that inefficiencies, such as monopolies or imperfect markets, are at play, influencing when and why prices diverge from these objective costs. Buchanan emphasizes the subjective nature of costs. He argues that costs are not objective or universal, but rather they are deeply personal and tied to individual choice. The key insight here is that costs are future-oriented. They exist only when choices are made, and they can only be measured by the person making the choice. Buchanan's view directly challenges the classical economic notion that costs can be objectively determined and measured, independent of individual preferences or circumstances. To illustrate, Buchanan famously states, costs necessarily follow choice and are dated at that moment of choice. This perspective forces us to consider the dynamic personal factors that shape decision making, making the concept of cost more flexible and individualistic than traditional economics suggests. Buchanan argues that market equilibrium is reached when participants' plans are mutually satisfied, emphasizing that prices are driven by subjective costs rather than any inherent efficiency. This highlights the importance of individual choices in determining market outcomes. Buchanan also addresses the common misconception from Keynesian economics that public expenditures, especially during times of underemployment, have low opportunity costs. He challenges the idea that public projects are inexpensive just because resources are underused, suggesting that these claims rely on narrow objective measures like market wages. Instead, the true opportunity costs should consider the value of alternative projects that could have been pursued. Ultimately, Buchanan's perspective calls for economists to move beyond objective measures and consistently apply subjective opportunity costs to accurately reflect real-world decision-making. Buchanan critiques cost-benefit analysis in public policy. He points out that fundamental disconnect between the values of individual choosers and calculations made by economists. Traditional cost-benefit analysis often relies on objective measurements, yet Buchanan argues that these calculations might ignore the subjective nature of costs that arise from individual choices. This critique highlights a normative bias in the way economists assess public projects, as their objective measurements can overlook the true subjective opportunity costs of alternative choices. For policymakers, this means that public projects should consider the personal values and preferences of individuals affected by the decision, not merely rely on broad impersonal calculations. Buchanan's view suggests that better decision-making can occur when subjective opportunity costs are fully accounted for in public policy. Buchanan also critiques the Pigouvian approach to externalities, which is often used to justify government tax and subsidy policies aimed at correcting externalities. In the traditional Pigouvian model, policymakers assume that externalities can be addressed by taxing or subsidizing behaviors based on observable cost. However, Buchanan points out a critical issue. Costs are subjective, and only individuals can measure them at the moment of choice. If individuals respond to alternative kinds of opportunity costs that are personal to them, costs that aren't observable or measurable by others, then policymakers are left at a disadvantage. Buchanan emphasizes this point by stating, observed money outlays need not reflect choice-influencing cost, the genuine opportunity cost that the decision-maker considers. Furthermore, Buchanan highlights that when individuals develop other regarding norms, as is common in civil society, the divergence between private and social costs become more pronounced. This challenges the basic assumptions of Pigouvian taxes and subsidies, as is unclear how these policies can account for the subjective individual experiences and values. Buchanan applies his cost and choice logic to military service costs. The opportunity costs for individuals entering military service are not the same for everyone. For some, the sacrifice of personal freedom, career, or family might be significant, while for others, the trade-off may be less impactful. This variation in perceived cost challenges the idea of a standard objective calculation of the cost of military service. Thus, it is impossible for military planners to know the true cost of running their military. Buchanan also considers criminal behavior and deterrence. The costs perceived by criminals in terms of punishment or societal disapproval are highly subjective. These costs depend on individual norms, personal circumstances, and social influences, making it difficult to predict behavior using objective measures of deterrence. Lastly, Buchanan applies his critique to the socialist planning debate. He argues that central planners often overlook the subjective costs experienced by individuals in society. Planners may make decisions based on what seems efficient from an aggregate or objective standpoint, but they fail to consider the unique preferences, values, and subjective experiences that individuals bring to the decision-making process. This oversight can lead to inefficient or undesirable outcomes when trying to plan for an entire society. The core lesson is that cost is subjective and driven by individual choices, rather than being an objective, universally measurable concept. This perspective challenges traditional economic models that assume costs can be calculated independently of the chooser. The implication for economics is clear. We need to shift our focus towards an understanding of individual choices and preferences to improve the predictive power of models. Finally, Buchanan recommends a shift in policymaking as well. Policymakers should avoid making assumptions about objective costs, as these fail to capture the true subjective nature of costs that individuals experience when making decisions. This approach would lead to more accurate economic planning and better policy outcomes. In closing, Buchanan emphasizes a critical point. Only if costs can be objectified can they be divorced from choice. This underscores the central theme of his work, that cost is inherently tied to the individual choice and cannot be separated from the personal perspective of the decision maker. If we try to objectify costs, we risk losing the core subjective nature of decision making that drives economic behavior. Buchanan's work pushes us to rethink how we approach economics, urging us to focus on the individual and their choices to better understand costs rather than relying on abstract, objective measures that may not capture the true nature of economic decisions.